Section 4.4 gets into the trigonometric functions of any angle. Everything that we have done so far is all related to 30, 60, 90, 45, 45, 90, or 60, 30, 90 triangles. But we can use some patterns to derive trig functions for any angle in any quadrant, even if it doesn't look like it's on the unit circle. So the first thing we want to look at is, when are different trig functions positive or negative? And we've got a little mnemonic device that we can use. And it's that all students take calculus. All students take calculus. And what this is saying is that if I look at the first letter of each word, that is going to tell me which trig function is positive in which quadrant. So right here, A is the first letter of the first word, which means that all the trig functions are going to be positive in the first quadrant. The second word here, which is students, this represents the second quadrant since it's the second word, and the first letter is S, which means sine is going to be positive in the second quadrant. The third word indicates the third quadrant, and the first letter is T, which indicates that tangent is going to be positive in the third quadrant. And then finally, the fourth word is tied to the fourth quadrant, and we see it starts with C, which means cosine is going to be positive in the fourth quadrant. So if I look at my quadrants here, quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4, I know in the first quadrant that everything is going to be positive. X and Y's are both positive, which means for the trig functions, all are going to be positive. If I look at the second quadrant, I know that X's are going to be negative and Y's are going to be positive. And in terms of trig functions that are going to be positive, S here stands for sine being positive, which lines up with the fact that Y values are also the sine values, as well as its reciprocal. Cosecant is also going to be positive in the second quadrant. Same thought process for the third quadrant. We know that X's are going to be negative and Y's are going to be negative. So in terms of trig functions that are positive, it's going to be tangent and cotangent, because if I divide two negatives, I get a positive. And then finally, in the fourth quadrant, we have X's being the positive values and Y's being the negative values. And in terms of trig functions, cosines are the X values, so cosines are positive, along with its reciprocal secant. So to summarize this, the mnemonic device, all students take calculus, helps us remember where we have positive trig functions. The first quadrant, everything is positive. The second quadrant, S, stands for sine being positive, and its reciprocal, cosecant, is positive. The other four are negative. The third quadrant starts with a T, tangent here for take, and that indicates tangent is positive, as well as its reciprocal, cotangent. All the others are negative. And then finally, the fourth quadrant is the fourth word, starts with C, which means cosine is positive, and its reciprocal, secant, and all the other trig functions, sine, tangent, cosecant, and cotangent, are all negative. So here we just want to know, are we going to have positive or negative values? 75 degrees is in the first quadrant, and everything is positive in the first quadrant, so the cosine will be positive. In my second example, sine of negative 75 is in the fourth quadrant, because if I go clockwise, I end up right about there. And we know in the fourth quadrant, only cosines and secants are positive, which means everything else is negative, so sines are negative. We're going to use those patterns to help determine our angle measurements in standard position. So if I give you a point, I can determine what all 6 trig functions are going to be. So starting here with the point negative 24, 10. I know this is going to be in the second quadrant because I have a negative x value and a positive y. So if I go over to the left, that's negative, then up is positive. So somewhere in the second quadrant, right about there, is going to be the point negative 24, 10. And I'm going to draw a triangle in. One line always goes through 0, 0, or goes to 0, 0. And I need to know which way is my other line going to go. Am I going to complete the triangle horizontally here, going to the y-axis, or vertically to the x-axis? And this ties back into what we talked earlier about reference triangles. We are going to draw a reference triangle. And a reference triangle is always, always, always based off of the x-axis. So my only 4 options for a reference triangle looks like this. First quadrant, it would be right there because a piece of the triangle is the x-axis. The second angle is right there based off of the x-axis. The third angle, if I'm in the third quadrant, is down there. Once again, one side being the x-axis. And then finally, the fourth quadrant would look like that. One side based off of the x-axis. And this gives us that bow tie look we talked about earlier. So I'm going to complete my triangle by dropping a value down there. So now that I've got that, I know my x-axis side is going to be negative 24. My y-axis side is going to be 10. And I need to figure out what the hypotenuse is. Since this is a right triangle, I can use Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, where a's and b's are x's and y's. So negative 24 squared plus 10 squared is equal to c squared. And if you simplify that down, you'll get 26. If you remember your Pythagorean triples, 10, 24, 26 is one of the Pythagorean triples. So the last piece, now that I've got all these sides in, is to come up with our ratios. Inside our triangles, our theta measurement. We know sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Opposite over hypotenuse is 10 over 26. The cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse, negative 24 over 26. Tangent, opposite over adjacent, opposite over adjacent, negative 10 over 24. And then finally, the other 3 trig functions are reciprocals. So the cosecant is going to be 26 over 10, the reciprocal of sine. The secant, reciprocal of cosine, is negative 26 over 24. And then finally, the cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, negative 24 over 10.